In what has become a familiar but still uneasy scene, former President Trump was arraigned this week after being indicted by a Washington, D.C. grand jury on 4 charges relating to the events leading up to the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Former President Trump lost the 2020 election and knew he lost, but spread lies that fraud had stolen the election from him. He used those lies to make his claims of fraud appear legitimate, to create an intense national atmosphere of mistrust and anger, and erode public faith in the administration of the election. So reads the first few lines of the indictment against Mr. Trump, an indictment that for the next 44 pages lays out the case that prosecutors will lay out in a court of law about the 4 felony charges against him. He's alleged conspiracy to defraud the United States, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding, obstruction of an attempt to obstruct an official proceeding, and conspiracy against rights. Joining me this morning to talk about the legal and political ramifications of these history-making charges, KPRC2 legal analyst Brian Weiss and UH political professor Brandon Rottinghouse, whose specialties include the presidency, Texas politics, and political scandal, which is perfect for our conversation today.
You think?
Hey, yeah. Hey, thank you for being here for this conversation for the next 10 minutes and Newsmakers Extra as well. Brian, tell me about this indictment number 3. All experts we've talked to, I've heard them say that this is historic, more historic than what's come before, and it's difficult to overemphasize how this is so much bigger than the others.
Absolutely, Cam. Look, not to make light of a very, very serious situation, but if you can break these 3 indictments down, New York hush money, Mar-a-Lago documents, and January 6th, think of them as the Kardashians, okay? If New York is Rob and Mar-a-Lago is Chloe, make no mistake, what happened the other day is definitely Kim. This indictment is so consequential because it not only impacts conduct that Mr. Trump allegedly committed while he was the commander-in-chief of this great country, but it, in my estimation, represents a clear and present danger to how he spends the golden years of his life. Because make no mistake, if he is convicted on any or all of these 4 charges, there is almost a default presumption in federal court that he's going to become a ward of the federal government.
So we'll talk more about that a little bit later on those charges and how significant they are and how difficult it is to get out of those kinds of charges. Dr. Rottinghouse, as bad as it might seem to us laymen, Mr. Trump does not seem to have been seriously impacted by any of this as he works for another term for the White House. For example, he's leading in all the polls among GOP candidates for president. The new New York Times Siena poll says 54% of likely primary voting Republicans say they'd vote for him, 17% Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and a huge drop to 3% shared by former VP Pence, former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, and Senator Tim Scott. And what may also be interesting, CNN poll found that 67% of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say that the President Biden was illegitimately elected. That speaks volumes about the political climate we're in right now, does it not?
It does. I think that the kind of cornerstone of this is just the fact that scandals don't hit like they used to. It was the case back in the 70s through the 80s that scandals were debilitating for politicians, and getting caught in one was tantamount to political death. But that's not the case anymore. You've got partisanship that's so pertinent now and so fervent now that it's hard to get away from it. And rallying your base after being indicted is now just a kind of commonplace occurrence. And so those kinds of things definitely have changed the landscape of how we think about politicians who are caught up in these messes.
And the media seems to be very complicit in this, no matter which side you look at. I looked at some of the far-right media, and it's just a whole different world.
Yeah.
And when you look at how it's being perceived, it's a Hunter Biden story for the right-wing media, while the rest of the world is looking at the onslaught against democracy.
That's right. We know that, elites still matter, right? Partisanship has basically created this sort of ecosystem where people live in their own worlds, and that's generated kind of alternative narratives on questions. And so instead of it being a day where Donald Trump was arraigned, it's a day where Hunter Biden is not being talked about, according to many of these news outlets. So I think that's definitely a problem for how we access accountability, because at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want to hold politicians accountable, and theoretically, that's what this whole process is for.
So, Brian, we've already heard a hint of the defense the Trump team may be planning. Listen to Trump attorney John Lauro earlier this week on the Today Show.
It's the first time that a sitting president is attacking a political opponent on First Amendment grounds and basically making a criminal to state your position and to engage in political advocacy.
I've got to give you a little time out on that one, because of
we've
course,
never seen that before.
Well, the indictment specifically says that the president has a First Amendment right to speech.
Yes.
He even has a First Amendment right to lie.
So the indictment does seem to have fault with the actions that resulted from speech rather than speech itself, correct?
Absolutely. Look, the indictment acknowledges former President Trump's First Amendment right to think as he wants to think and not to be cavalier, but to lie like a dog if he wants to. That's not criminal. But remember, for those of us who didn't sleep through the professor's class at U of H, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. The First Amendment, the Constitution, isn't a suicide pact. And the fact is that these lies helped fuel an unlawful criminal attempt to interfere with the electoral process, the orderly transition of power, and ultimately our democracy. And so there are limits to free speech. This case will test them. But above and beyond that, Cam, I think one of the defenses that we will likely see is my lawyers were, this is a legal term we use, morons. That I listened to people like Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Jeffrey Clark, Kenneth Cheeseborough, who we'll talk about in a minute, and I had every right to rely upon their advice. In fact, in state court, the Texas Penal Code creates a defense based upon so-called advice of counsel. But this is going to be a very difficult road for them to hoe.
So I want to show you something that former Vice President Pence talked about, because he's been rather quiet throughout all of this. But after the indictment, he's been much more vocal. This is what he said after the indictment, and it's much more than he said in many, many months. Take a listen.
I dismissed it out of hand, but sadly, the president was surrounded by a group of crackpot lawyers that kept telling him what his itching ears wanted to hear. On that day, President Trump asked me to put him over the Constitution, but I chose the Constitution.
So do you think that his coming out like he's coming out, and maybe other GOP rivals for the presidency are maybe going to be emboldened? I don't know. What do you sense that's going to happen, and will it make any difference?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think we're seeing a bit of a split politically. You know, some of the people running are saying that they'll pardon Donald Trump if he wins, and some of the attorneys are privately saying from Donald Trump that they hope he wins because it would basically like let this go away. They can pardon himself, which is still legally dubious. So that's certainly going to split the party in a way that's not good for their hopes to be able to train their focus on Joe Biden. That's what they want. And keep in mind that this is a campaign that's not just about the presidency. There are dozens of Senate seats down ballot that the Republicans want to win back from Democrats, and they were poised to do so before a lot of this took place. So the fact that they're now talking about the 2020 election again, which is a political loser for them, the fact that they're having to talk about Donald Trump and defend him means that they're not getting to talk about how much they don't like Joe Biden. So I think Mike Pence being in the corner of this is really stunning, given this sort of moment historically, but also the fact that he's running also for president against Donald Trump. And so these things are all going to kind of come to a head at this political moment.
We're going to continue to talk about that on Newsmakers Extra as well. But Brian, you have an interest in the unindicted co-conspirators named this week. Even though they're unnamed, you think that they're going to be coming before the bar here soon?
I don't think you need to be Karl Rove or Felix Frankfurter to see that these 6 yet indicted co-conspirators are going to have their day in court. Look, Cam, I've learned more from popular culture than I have from dusty law books. One of my favorite scenes from Goodfellas is where a young Henry Hill is told by Robert De Niro, you took your first pinch like a man and you learned the 2 most valuable things in life. Always keep your mouth shut and never rat on your friends. Well, everybody says that until the prison doors slam behind them. Everybody's a tough guy until they see themselves in a jumpsuit. These 6 people, and remember, it's ironic, perhaps delicious on some, but 5 of the 6 are lawyers. And so some of the names that we've talked about before, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, Kenneth Cheeseborough, Jeff Clark, John Eastman, and a yet-to-be-named political consultant. These people have not been named, have not been indicted, but I am telling you that was an incredibly strategic move on Jack Smith's part. He wants to squeeze these people much like he would in an organized crime case, because I'm telling you, they may think nobody talks, everybody walks. I've seen that movie, and it ends a whole lot differently.
And we'll talk more about that in Newsmakers Extra as well. Lots to talk about, and good conversation. Thank you, guys.